Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to this special stream for ANZAC Day 2025. To give people a bit of time to join the stream, etc., I am going to start us off with a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wild. Your new God's sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By hopeless speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love that heed and folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard, the cry of those ye humor, are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly profit laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come down to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with dear bought wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of thankless years.
Of course, the excellent Australian musician, Chris Card. And you will have noticed in that film there's a fair bit of there's some ANZACs, and a lot of the stuff filmed in the Antarctic was actually filmed by an Australian cameraman. Anyway, this is our special stream for ANZAC Day in 2025. We may have one or two more guests joining us in due course, I hope. But in the meantime, we've got Eucharist League, and we've also got Harry Richardson from the British Australian community. Perhaps you chaps would like to introduce yourselves and say a few words about the organisations that you represent.
Okay.
Maybe Eucharist League, go first.
Okay. I'm the leader of the Eucharist League. We're a Sydney-based patriotic fraternity of young men dedicated towards building mateship and advocating for our nation. And you can join us at our Eucharist League contact and on Telegram. And we have a Instagram account, we have a TikTok account, we have a X account, and we have a Telegram account. Yeah, we're growing and improving quite well. Anyways, Harry, do you want to go?
I'm Harry Richardson, so I'm the president of the British Australian community, which is unusual, an unusual community because we are actually a part of the multicultural community, which is not unusual that people are part of the multicultural community, except that we are representing traditional Australians as part of the multicultural community, because everyone else, such as Sudanese Australians or Chinese Australians or Indian Australians, all have their own organizations. But everyone forgot that white Anglo-descended or European Australians, who were the traditional Australians that built the country, didn't have any kind of representative in the multicultural community. So we've taken that slot, and we're advocating for the rights of the traditional Australians through the multicultural community. So that's our position there. I do a couple of other things. I've written a couple of books, and I'm the editor of the Richardson Post. But if you want to find the British Australian community, like Eucharist, we're on most of the social media. We're pretty big on most of the social media, particularly X. X is probably our best platform, but we're also on TikTok plenty. I think we've got what's the other ones? Instagram, YouTube, of course. We do quite a few videos. So that's what we're part of.
Just to let people know, I will have after the stream, I will put a link to whatever contact details these gents want me to put up. So if you want to find them, you'll be able to do so after the stream. And I will, before we close, get them to give a plug for their groups again. Just to let people know, I have invited several other Australians to this stream, but I can't force people to come on. One chap, for example, I was hoping Tim Wilms would join this stream, but unfortunately he's doing a stream himself at the moment. So unless we go pretty long, he probably won't. I am expecting at least one other Aussie guy to join us at some point. Marcus Furious, if you know him, you will know who he is, who I've streamed with before. He's a good dude. All right, I suppose to start off, I'm going to ask you guys what ANZAC Day means to you. And I'm just going to go clockwise. So Eucharist, what does ANZAC Day stand for to you?
Well, to me, it stands for all the men and all the soldiers who fundamentally gave their lives to defend Australia as a Anglo-Celt, in the words of John Curtin, as a citadel of Anglo-Saxon civilization.
Fair enough.
Fundamentally to glorify their memory, and yeah, that's it basically.
Harry, what's your thoughts on ANZAC Day as we approach it?
Well, I grew up in England, and ANZAC Day was something I hadn't heard of until I met some Kiwis in London. I think it was the first time I heard of it. But coming over to Australia, over in England, it's the big celebration. It tends to be Poppy Day, which is November the 11th. If I'm not mistaken. So that's the big Remembrance Day over there. In Australia, they have the ANZAC Day, which celebrates really the first, because in the UK, like the battles, the British have been fighting battles since anyone can remember, whereas the Australians, after they formed this amazing nation, they never got into a war until the First World War, and they went across, and their first taste of battle was a disaster.
Not quite true, you know, Harry. That's not quite true.
Sudan and the Boer, right?
Yeah, the very first diggers were the guys who took part in the Gordon Relief Expedition in the Sudan in 1885. They included the New South Wales contingent, And if you go to Circular Quay in Sydney, you can still see a park to those guys where the ferries leave from. And then, as someone in the chat said, quite a lot of Australians fought in the Anglo-Boer War as well.
Right. Okay. But I think the first big one. It was the first big one. I mean, did they have conscription?
After Federation, you could say after Federation, the first war was the First World War. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first time they fought as Australians, because before Federation, I think that they would have probably fought as British. Like or Brits from Australia, I suppose, mostly. But I mean, it was the first big outing, and it was from, by all accounts, hell on earth. And like, to me, the sacrifices, and it's funny because I'm not a military person. I'm not from a military family at all. None of my grandparents fought in the war for various reasons. My uncle didn't fight in the war. He was never called up. It was like they forgot his name and just didn't call him up. And like most people in that situation, volunteered, but he didn't. He wasn't a very pleasant person, to be honest with you. A lot of people didn't like him. But so I don't have a military background, but it's funny because when I see these military parades and things, I have this feeling that just my whole soul feels this sacrifice that these people have made. And I think I'm getting control of it now, but I have a tendency to actually start crying. Tears start running down my cheeks, and I can't help myself. I just watch this stuff, and I have this my imagination starts to go wild. And I've read enough stuff of wars and conflict situations, especially in the modern age. It was no picnic in the earlier ages, but imagine being in trenches with the hellish conditions, just in a trench without someone raining shells down on you and people being blown to pieces and God knows what. It's beyond imagination almost for someone who's like myself. I've grown up really in a cosseted situation, and I see that I look at these soldiers and the sacrifices that they've made hit me really hard. And I think a lot of people don't. I know Kipling, who you played before, sort of covered that quite well. What was what was the poem that he had about Tommy this and Tommy that?
White Man's Burden. Cool. White Man's Burden, I think.
No, it's not the White Man's Burden. That was the White Man's Burden.
No, he's talking about a different one called Tommy. Yeah,
okay. Tommy.
Chris Gard has actually covered that as a song, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, right. Okay. And the story of that was an interesting one because they used to call the English soldiers Tommies, and the reason they called them Tommies was because when you joined the army, you had a bunch of forms to fill out, and so they used to have like a sample form, and we'd probably use the name Joe Bloggs, but they used the word Tommy Atkins, and so
Tommy
that's where
Atkins, yes.
Atkins,
apparently picked by the Duke of Wellington when he was Commander-in-Chief.
Right. Okay. And so that was why they were called Tommies, and so he talked about them being Tommies and Tommy this, Tommy that. And his thing was, when war's brewing, everyone's like, oh, the soldiers, the soldiers are so great. As soon as the danger's passed, it's like, they wouldn't spit on you. And for me, I just feel that weight of the sacrifice and the just this gratitude and like it's just, I find tears just well up. It's funny. It has this effect on me. I don't know why. It just really does. So Anzac Day to me is a part of that. It's I see the guys marching past in the jeeps, like these old guys, and I could just imagine them in their young days. 18, 17, 20, and with their mates being having their arms blown off and God knows what. I think my mother was very affected by the Second World War. She was 9 when it broke out, and spent her nights at 2 a.m. cowering underneath the kitchen table. They all got dragged out of bed and they used to cower under the kitchen table. She said, I don't know what her parents thought that the kitchen table was going to do, but they thought it might give them some protection. So and she used to tell a lot of stories. When she was after the war, she was in Hastings, and she worked in a little corner shop, and she said the old guys used to come in and they used to buy snuff. And these were World War I veterans, and they'd been gassed in the trenches. And chlorine gas is the most horrific thing. I worked in factories that made the stuff. It's terrible. You want to keep well away from the stuff. These people have been gassed with it, and that even like years later, this is decades later, the only relief they could get for this awful chest would be to take snuff. They'd snort this snuff, which is like a kind of powdered tobacco, to give them relief. And so she had all these stories like this of this the horrors of war, and it just it affects me for some reason. So yeah, that's my feeling on Anzac Day.
Yeah, I mean, I think Australia Day and Anzac Day are the two big national days in Australia. So that's what I think about it. Is if you're a patriotic Australian, Australia Day and Anzac Day are the 2 days you're allowed to show it, basically.
That's very sad, actually, because when I first came to Australia, one of the first things that struck me was patriotism. Because in the UK, I don't know if you remember from when you were a kid, you're about my age, I'm 62 now. Growing up was, there's people that wave a Union Jack here and there, and it's or sing, what was it, Land of Hope and Glory occasionally, but generally patriotism was looked on as kind of a bit lowbrow. It was like there was this.
Well, I was pretty lowbrow when I was brought up. I mean, I was born in Bermondsey in the middle of South London, like kind of docks area, but in the south side. So I was pretty lowbrow, and most people I knew when I was a kid and a teenager were still pretty patriotic, to be honest with you.
Yeah, they were patriotic, but they wouldn't show it. There wasn't, like, when I came to Australia, I found that the Australians were really much more openly, proud of the country. It's like, I mean, you watch the adverts and it's like Aussie tough. This product is Aussie tough. It's tough like Oz, and it's tough like the Outback. And
these are old adverts you're talking about. Australia seems to have lost that stuff.
Absolutely,
recently.
Absolutely. It's been gradually ground out of the people, and I mean, like, there was adverts. I remember there used to be this a series of adverts. I'm trying to remember what it was. It was like I can't even remember what it was advertising, but there was this old Aussie bloke, real sort of growly Aussie bloke voice, and he had this guy work for him who was like it was obviously a gay guy called Brian, who used to go, "No, it's not Brian, it's Brian," and he's like, "Oh, right, Brian, yeah, whatever," and you just wouldn't have that. It would be, the LGBT guys would be up in arms. I mean, Australia was just so much more of a, that sort of raw, patriotic, hardcore, blokey sort of a society. It's more blokey, I think, than the English society.
It was. Australians are louder generally than English or British people. Or they used to be anyway. But I mean, I came here from South Africa.
Extroverts got shipped here. All the criminal types got shipped from to Australia, and
hang on. Before you say that, though, Eucharist, you have to point out that the vast majority of Australians are the descendants of free settlers. Yeah, they're not the descendants of convicts. Despite all the ragging that the Brits and the Aussies do between each other, most Australians are actually free settlers' descendants. But it used to be a much more blokey place, and I actually liked it. But I came here from South Africa, which is even louder. So it was,
No, I did. I liked it. I mean, I'm not from a high class background, and I loved the egalitarianism of it. It was I'd have friends of it. It's funny because I met English people who were really class and became great friends with them. And if we were in the UK, they would have never given me the time of day. I found that very much with Australia, which was one of the things that I really liked about it, was that there wasn't that classness, because the UK has this a very ancient and entrenched class system, which Australia didn't get, because I think it was so egalitarian, because they opened up the land.
Australian the trade unions in the the late 19th and early 20th century, basically. I think was the primary reason that Australia had such a much more of a egalitarian aspect to it, because basically the trade unions won, and fundamentally they were also very anti non-white immigration in this country. So I think fundamentally that's the main reason why Australia developed like that. And also another aspect was like in Australia, like you can't really have as many class divides because it's like the frontier, more or less. Frontiersmanship
exactly.
and pioneers makes it so that you have to basically be more equal. So I think
In the UK, all the farmland was owned by the lords. It wasn't quite feudal, but it was the wealthy owned much of the land. In Australia, they opened the land up and had to hand huge packets of land out to people who were just ordinary farmers that became very wealthy. So there was not that entrenched class system in there, which there is in the UK. So I think that was a big part of it personally. But I'm not a historian, so but that's just what would strike me.
Furious, how are you going, mate?
Hello, chaps. Apologies for my tardiness. I tried to jump on as soon as I can, but thank you for the invite, Iron Duke and Eurekist and Harry. Lovely to make your acquaintance and to share this lovely stream with you guys regarding Anzac Day.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you the same question I asked the other two blokes. What does Anzac Day mean to you?
I actually just caught the end of what Eurekist and Harry said, so I'd like to circle back to the land ownership, agricultural thing, but we'll put a bookmark there for a second. Just to answer your question. I think Anzac Day, I'm sort of wary about being too superficial here, but I think at least at the surface level, what it is the sort of public respect, and adoration is not the correct word, but this sort of public respect and reverence for the heroic archetype, and for the, not to sound trite, because every half-wit politician uses the word sacrifice in this context, but for the fact that if you think of the sort of military engagements in which Australia has found itself part of, both pre and post federation. I mean, in that sense, I'm including the Boer Wars and to some extent, some of the sort of the frontier friction that existed in Australia, before the total sort of.
We also mentioned the Sudan, Furious, which was the very first diggers who went across to try and help General Gordon in the Sudan.
Yes. Gordon Pasha and the relief force, of course. Indeed, that's to skip my mind, but that's quite true. And hence why I use the frame of pre and post federation, because obviously Australia did have some, adventures prior to federation in 1901. And I think what's sort of intriguing is that America and Australia, in sort of their own way, have, despite the immense pressures of, shall I call it, sort of modernism and liberalism, have still somehow managed to find a way to keep this reverence and respect for the fighting man, even though it has been sadly largely debased, and it is sadly used by politicians for ulterior motives. Regrettably, there's still this public sentiment that sits within us, where I think that feeling towards the soldiers and towards those who had fought in wars and had perished in wars is actually quite sincere and genuine. So for me, I think that that deference given to the heroic archetype and to sacrifice in war is a very real thing, and I think something that any healthy country and any sort of upstanding moral society must have and ought to have. So that's my sort of surface level take, and I think for Australia particularly, again, I'm a bit cautious of rehashing sort of trite modern political fluff, but I think without doubt, in the sort of same way that the War of Independence is sort of this thing for America that gives us a sense of identity and a sense of self-recognition, doubtless I think those just to some degree the Boer War, but certainly the Australian input and the Australian efforts in World War One, be it the Palestine campaign, be it the obviously Gallipoli most famously, that they had a very sort of galvanizing effect on the Australian psyche and on the Australian sense of self very, very early in its sort of life as a unified country post federation. And again, I think the tragedy for guys like us is that we sort of see that being used in very cynical ways by politicians, whereby, you know, in a more sort of honest society, you know, we would understand that being a good thing. And I think those of us, you know, who think as we do, can at least partition that idea that even though politicians misuse it in the present day, it's still actually true that it is a part of Australian history and a part of our identity, and is something of a solid part of our foundation mythos as a country and a society.
We were talking just before you came on, Furious, about how Australia traditionally, I don't think it's true anymore, largely, but it used to be, even when I first moved here 25 years ago, Australia was traditionally quite blokey. Mateship was a real big deal here. And I just think that's being so diluted and to a large degree destroyed in modern Australia today. I don't know what you, Furious, and then the other blokes think about that, but that's certainly my impression.
Well,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, I was talking before. You guys go ahead. My apologies.
I think that the whole blokey thing it was basically white blokes, really. Let's be honest. It was the Australian blokes and mates were people like Paul Hogan, or those sort. It was it's part of a white Australian mythos, if you want to call it that, or whatever. And that has been basically the white Australian males, like the white British males or white American males or white Christian males everywhere, have been under attack from the whatever you want to call them, cultural Marxists or whoever, communists or whatever.
Subversives, generally speaking.
Yeah, general subversives, whatever they are.
You can kind of trace a line from Parsons, the man from Snowy River, to Hogan's Crocodile Dundee. They're in a direct line. You can see that, but they just wouldn't make a movie like The Man from Snowy River or Crocodile Dundee anymore. They just wouldn't, you know.
Yeah, well, he was on the front page of the Australian last week, and was Hogan and Paul Hogan, and he was saying, "Oh yeah, that was Australia then, but it's changed now." And I was like, I mean, it's like, yes, it's been taken from the Australian people, and I think it's just so sad that we've been robbed. Really, it's been no one, our elites have had this project to just destroy this homogenous nation, and it's been white-handed from within, and it's just disgusting what's happened. We've been sold out by these traitors, these bloody worm-tongued traitors who've just sold us down the river with all this stuff that's coming from the universities, and it goes back. People say, "Oh, Gough Whitlam," whatever. It goes back well beyond Gough Whitlam. I mean, back in the 50s. The universities were pretty much taken over by the 1950s by these people, so that by the 50s, I've heard people say they were mopping up opposition by the 1950s in the universities. So this has been going on so long, and it's just been so incremental that boiling the frog so slowly, and it's just been and now people are really seeing the fruits of it. It's like when you got termites. You live in a house that's full of termites. You don't notice it until you grab hold of the door one day and it comes away in your hand or something. And that's the stage where we're at now, where everything's starting to creak and break, and there's people with machetes in the streets and God knows what. So yeah, I think that's where we are now.
Look, I've got something to say about this, but before I do, I want to ask Eucharist, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, first thing, it's obviously terrible, and I think fundamentally one of the things that separates Australians from even other Anglos is our sense of egalitarianness and our sense of this term's obviously corrupted by the left, but fundamentally just socialism. This more or less the breakdown of the rigid and fundamentally unnatural classes system towards the more folkish and more or less communitarian system of society. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And our organization, with one of our mottos, it's Nation, Mateship, and Action, is of course rebuilding this form of mateship, building this form of egalitarianness. We don't one of the reasons we think that of course a very infamous National Socialism is fundamentally wrong is just because one of the aspects of National Socialism is just so dictatorial, so like it's almost a caricature of Germanness with its sense of just like I think it's called the Führer principle, and it's like, well, we fundamentally just reject this. Now we understand as Australians, as Australians and Anglos, we understand that there's a sense of natural authority. Like even on the grave markers of ANZAC, there's like for king, country, for king and country, and we understand that there must be authority, but we fundamentally also understand that there must be a sense of mateship, a sense of equality among members, and this is one of the things we fight for, to build back mateship.
Yeah, look, I as I said before we started streaming, I'm no sort of neo-Nazi at all. But on the other hand, there are some people in that part of the world, in that part of the political world, who I don't despise by any means. What I much more despise is the horrible lack of free speech and the stuff that the Australian governments in places like Victoria and indeed the federal government are trying to do, so that people can't protest because they just don't like them. To me, that's fundamentally un-Australian, that you can stop people protesting or doing whatever they want. I think that's fundamentally un-Australian to do that stuff.
I think to me it's a really sad indictment of our society and our times that people would actually think that Nazism is preferable to what we have now. I think that's just such a
I actually wouldn't go that far, to be honest, Harry. I'll be honest. I can see why some people do, to be honest. I really.
I mean, yeah.
And I'm not a neo-Nazi. I'm not. I never have been.
Nazism is like communism. It holds out all these. Nazism holds out all these. It's like communism. Hey, we're all going to be the same, and these rich people share the money out, and we'll all be a lot better off. It's like they have all these things that they offer you, and Nazism is the same. It offers all these things, but the reality is not. It's basically as you were saying before, it's fundamentally a rigid hierarchical system with like no freedom of speech. Everyone has, I think it just doesn't sit well. Certainly not with Anglos, but generally with Europeans. But it's not something that appeals to me at all.
Don't get me wrong. Hang on one second, Furious.
No, all good.
All I'm trying to say here is that I see why some young white guys in Australia turn to this, is because where else do they go in the system we're in at the moment? I'm not saying I agree with it, but I can see why they do.
Absolutely. I agree with what you're saying there. Yeah, I mean, like I say, it holds out these sort of promises, and people are tempted because things are so bad. Kids now, young white kids, they've got no chance of getting a house. They've got, they're probably going to get discriminated against in employment. They get discriminated against in just, they're put down, constantly abused, and they're like, hell, if this Nazi idea is like, we'd be at the top of the tree instead of being at the bottom, and this is what's causing this, and it's a reaction, it's a knee jerk to the situation that people find themselves in. I think that is really sad, but I like you, I understand why they feel that way. I completely get it.
What I'm trying to say is that, like, the founding stock of Australia, which as you, Harry, rightly said, the founding stock of Australia is basically Anglo-Celtic, and they're at the bottom of everything now.
Yes.
Particularly if you're a man.
We have an inverted hierarchy, ethnic hierarchy, and this is why we're in the multicultural movement, because the multicultural movement is a hierarchy. There's groups at the top, and there's a groups below them, and groups below them, and then right at the bottom is the traditional Anglo-Celts.
If you're a straight white Anglo-Celtic man in Australia
Christian
today, a Christian man, you're right at the bottom of the hierarchy, according to most of the left and a good many of the so-called liberals. I'm using the liberals with a small L rather than the pi. You understand?
What we wrote about in our book is that oh God, I've just lost what I was going to say then. We're writing about in the book that when they talk about diversity, because they always talk about diversity, but when you actually take it apart and say, well, what do you actually mean by diversity? So you go to a company and they say, oh, we've got a diversity quota.
Mostly anti-white, basically.
Yeah, it basically means, so they'll say, oh, we're 47% diverse. What does that mean? Well, we've only got 53% of white males. That's what they mean. So diversity means lack of white men, white straight.
It's a polite way of saying white displacement.
Yes. Yep. So exactly. It's a polite way of putting it. It's a lie. And it's a very egregious lie. It's basically just discrimination. And they talk about, oh, well, it's positive discrimination. Well, there's no such thing as, what you talk about positive discrimination? It's just discrimination. It's just, they call it positive because it's the discrimination they want. We're discriminating against you, so it's positive. It's
100%. 100%, Harry, you're totally correct.
It's doubly tragic and doubly egregious insofar that, and I say this as someone obviously with a deep mooring in history. I know I haven't streamed with you blokes before, but I mean, what I'm saying is, like, I do have a body of work on YouTube that is related to history, just if you didn't know. But one thing I will say is that what is definitively or ostensibly meant to be the point of a society or a government or whatever the political leadership is of a place is that they're people, and in essence the older I've got, the more narrow my definition of that has become over time. But in essence, whether it's and of course the USA and Canada and Australia and New Zealand are obviously going to be a little bit different to, say, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy and Spain and whatever, whose countries have, shall I say, like, not only a more profound delineation, but also have a longer legacy to draw from. But even then, like, we understand that places like the USA and Australia and so on have an ethnogenesis, they have an origin story, they have a foundation by which it stems from a certain group of people or peoples that make that country what it is, or conceived of it from a start point, right, in a certain way. And in essence, what I'm trying to say is that those countries ought to sort of definitively or ostensibly create a sort of like a circumstance by which its people and its institutions and its its population, its economy, its social fabric ought to be safeguarded from external threats. It should be protected from internal subversion, and should be given the best prospects of future prosperity, both material and spiritual, right? And that those institutions and that entity is the birthright and is the collective belonging of that people, right? When those foundation stock people have their own institutions turned against them, that is what we see in the West today. And that is actually the most egregious aspect of it. It's one thing to even say, I'm not saying I disagree with you, by the way, but it's one thing to call it reverse discrimination or whatever. But what we are seeing is that people who are often, not always, but often not of that legacy stock, not of the founding, body of that nation, then get their hands on levers of power and turn those institutions against those who are of founding stock, and alienate them and dispossess them and displace them and put them onto a course of eventual erasure. That is the most egregious thing. And it's sad to have this conversation on ANZAC Day, but that is sadly the precarious situation much of the West finds itself on. And thankfully, guys like us have this conversation because no one else would.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I'm furious. I couldn't agree with you more, mate. I mean, like, I'm not a real Australian, and even if I live here until the day I die, I won't be a real Australian. I was born
You're
in
more
England.
one than I am. I am Duke.
No, I wouldn't say that was true, mate. You come from a farming family, for God's sake. I mean, you don't get much more Aussie than that, as far as I'm concerned, anyway. But
Fair enough, I'll take it.
But I get, we all have our heritages. But as far as I'm concerned, you're more Australian than I will ever be if I live here for another 30 years, which I very much doubt, because I'll be dead. But
You got many in you left, mate. Don't get too pessimistic.
well, we'll see. But the point is, yeah, I mean, and we're talking, we're doing an ANZAC Day stream, and like ANZAC Day to me is the ultimate in Australian manliness, Australian mateship, all the good things about Australia, pretty much.
Yeah, resilience, courage under fire.
Yeah. The man from Snowy River, fucking Crocodile Dundee, if you really want to go that far.
Rolf Harris.
Yeah. Well, no, definitely not that person. But, yeah, no, not that person. By the way, good day
Slim
to
Dusty, maybe.
Yeah, Slim Dusty, 100%. I mean, the pub with no beer, for God's sake. You don't get more Aussie than that, do you?
No.
But I'd just like to say good evening. Good evening to Bodvar Bjarki, who is a friend of mine and he's on my Discord. He's a good bloke. Good day, Bodvar Bjarki. But yeah, to me, it's like modern Australia, whilst it continues to some extent the Anzac Day stuff, I don't even like I don't like people being able to wear other people's medals. I don't like that. Like you carry them by all means carry those medals, but I don't like people actually wearing them. Like your dad's medals or your granddad's medals and what have you. You know what I mean? I don't like that. I think it's not right. And increasingly, half the Anzac Day parades that you watch are like women, and they're not old guys anymore. Like when I first came to Australia, I would go to an RSL on Anzac Day, and they would get the oldest RSL guy to do the two up, where everyone bets on how the coins are going to land, which was a traditional Australian soldiers game. And these days, it's just becoming more and more feminized all the time.
The one thing I just wanted to quickly touch on, I was going to mention this before, but you end up asking me the question about Anzac Day, and I got distracted. But there's this. I mean, yourself and the other fellas on the stream are more than welcome to counter signal or discuss or rebuke or whatever. Like, I don't mind. There's just me positing a thesis here, and that is that one of the things that makes Australia sort of in one way similar to America, but also a tad different, and I think presents sort of, if you could put them on a triangle, what differentiates Australia from America and likewise from the motherland of Britain is that, see, I suppose Australia and Australia and America both have this sort of, dare I call it, egalitarian element to it, which the other guys have rightly talked about. And in the American context, it was the War of Independence and literally fighting the throne, fighting the forces of King George and establishing Congress in the amongst the continental 13 states. And they succeeded in that rebellion and ended up being self-governing. In Australia, remained a part of the Commonwealth, but Australia was just so far away from Britain, and it was founded in a very different sort of environment to Britain. Partially free colonies, partially penal colonies, and probably Britain handled Australia in a different way as a result of the consequence of the War of Independence. Again, I could be mistaken, but that's just my take. And and also there was this thing, given that Australia is such a disparate country, you know, unlike say the USA, where you've actually got large swaths of very sort of fertile countryside, you know, wonderful places to plot cities, and everywhere from freaking, you know, New Orleans to you know, to Boston makes a suitable city site almost, you know, the floodplains notwithstanding. And then on the west coast, you've got cities like San Francisco and California. I mean, Australia, we've built our cities on the coast. We have, you know, in the west, we've got Perth, and then the east, you know, there's Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne. I'm not counting Canberra because that's an artificial construction. You've got Adelaide in the south, and also, you know, Hobart in Tassie. And then amongst those states, you have like a whole bunch of more minor places, you know, Launceston and, you know, Wagga Wagga and Townsville and Newcastle and whatever, right? It is what it is. And
I've been to all of those places, by the way.
you are a well-travelled man, Iron Duke.
Hobart.
But with the exception of the East Coast, which, you know, if you sort of have a bit of an interior, sort of going up, you know, around the, you know, the Blue Mountains and sort of into like the Riverina and so on, and say in Queensland you go to like Atherton Tablelands and, you know, into places like Toowoomba and Gundawindi and whatever. But sort of beyond then, it sort of gets harsh again. But Australia has this massive harsh interior, and of course, as we know, a lot of these rural places, you know, where we're talking Queensland or WA or New South Wales or whatever, Victoria, especially in the early days, I suppose, you know, there just wasn't a place for that, what I would call, not to talk ill of it, but like class nonsense. You know, like most people had to pull their weight, and also, and even unlike say the establishment of the 13 colonies, which, you know, initially were parceled out to, even if not major aristocracy, then minor aristocracy, we sort of like had no aristocratic parceling of land for the most part in Australia, right? A lot of it was free settlers, a lot of it was crown grants of land to free settlers, and sometimes, you know, some people even, you know, certainly in the early days, you know, won their way out of, or worked their way out of, like, you know, convict status and sort of became freed, if not themselves, then their descendants did, right? And it does present itself in a sort of a different kind of society than what old Britain would have been. But in a sense that if you sort of then fuse that with the course that British liberalism has taken, certainly this side of, let's call it the World Wars period, in plural, you know, in commas here, it has made it actually in some ways more vulnerable to the pathway we've gone politically, where sort of at one point in time Australians didn't care, and that made it hard for that ideology to cotton on. But because Australians were largely indifferent, once it cottoned onto them, they struggled to care enough to throw off the yoke of that ideology. And I think sadly that has made Australia very much vulnerable to the, like, these modern whims, shall I call them. And also, if we look at what made Australia sort of, and when I say egalitarian, I do not mean in this sort of truncated, disgusting, left-wing Marxist style in a sense. I mean aristocratic is, and I'm sorry to bore you guys with historical chat, but if you could imagine the way that like a Gallic or Germanic village that would meet with the Romans would be sort of egalitarian, in that you'd have like maybe a chieftain, a couple of, you know, bodyguards, a couple of like clan leaders, and then most people more or less held a similar status that wasn't enforced. It was kind of just existent. It was voluntary, and those people cooperated in their sort of communities, if I can put it that way. That's kind of how Australia was. It wasn't an enforced egalitarian. It was sort of like an incidental egalitarianism, the situational egalitarianism, right? And that there, when it's bottom up rather than top down, it can work. And it did in Australia for a long time. But it depended on this distinction between urban and rural. And what we've seen is, and I mean, ING, you know, we've talked about this several times now, like I'm in my mid-30s, right? I've seen it across my lifetime. And it even was a process that began before my life, just about. You know, when I even think about the district I grew up and was raised in, right? You know, I've seen a dramatic shrinkage in, you know, the size of the school and the number of homesteads, the number of farms. You know, like the district in which my family farmed for decades, when I was born, was an area controlled by, I want to say controlled, you know, owned and managed by over 20 families. That same area is now owned and managed by 4 families. There's been such a huge concentration and consolidation of farmland in these places that's actually altered the socio-fabric of these places markedly. But then less families means less children means less replacement. less population means less incentives to stay where you are. There's less opportunities. There's less of a social fabric. These places die on the vine. And so the kind of environment that fostered that mentality, that fostered that culture, vanishes. Everyone goes to the city and takes on the urban equivalent of that, which I don't think has benefited Australia at all. I don't know what Harry and Eureka's think, but that's just my hypothesis. And I think we're seeing the consequence of it, but I'd like to know what you guys think.
Go for it.
Yeah, I'd partially
guys.
agree. Yeah, I'd agree
I
that
thought-
the breakdown of the country is of the country lifestyle has dramatically destroyed the Australian spirit.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a natural thing in a way, because I guess especially with telemedia, we might call it. Like, I think from the time when television came along, probably like someone in Wagga Wagga or something like that can look at the TV and see what people in Sydney are up to and say, holy crap, that looks fantastic. There's all this stuff going on. That's what I'd like to do. And I think there's this pull. I think people kind of, I think there's just excitement in a city. And, people grow up on a farm. It's pretty quiet, especially Australian farms are so big that people crave company. I think maybe our population's too small in a way. Like if you're in farms in the UK, you're not that far from a city. You can jump in the car and go and have a night out in the local town. Whereas
Harry, could I disagree with you a little bit? As a pommy bastard, all right?
Yeah, go for it.
As a pommy bastard, I'm going to slightly disagree with you here. And I'll tell you why. When I first came to Australia in 2000, so 25 years ago, I was living on the Central Coast, which is a little bit north of Sydney, yeah? Like sort of Gosford, around that area. And I used to like my girl would take me on trips into Australia and show me things like the monument to the Australian horses in the First World War that's on a bridge in Sydney and stuff that she knew I would find interesting. And after we'd been there a couple of years, we sold our house and we pissed off and bought a 4-wheel drive off an ex-Royal Australian Air Force dude, a double cab Hilux 4-wheel drive, and we took our little Jack Russell dog and we did 18,000 kilometers through Australia, right up through the outback, up to Darwin, and then all the way along the top end, and then up the Cape York Peninsula, and we ended up living on Thursday Island in the Torres Strait. Wow. So we saw quite a lot of outback Australia, and back in 2003-ish, no, actually 2002, I suppose, mostly. And we took 6 or 7 months to do this trip. And I've got to say that when I first came here, all right, there was a little bit of gay rights stuff and LGBTQ stuff and feminism in places like Sydney, and I'm sure there would have been in Melbourne, which fortunately I hadn't visited at that time. I don't like Melbourne very much. But once you got out of the city and you got into the outback, even when you got into the country areas, it was way better. But once you got into the outback, it still was recognizably the outback. And the people you met were outback people. The pubs you went to were outback pubs with the sort of people you would expect to meet in an Australian outback pub. Like you could have put half of them into Crocodile Dundee and it would have been fine, right? Without actors, you could just have filmed it and you could put it in Crocodile Dundee and it would have been exactly all right. You'd get a nice little barmaid of about 19 and all these guys from like cow stations or sheep stations or farmers coming into the place,
Miners and stuff. Yeah.
yeah, and they were typical Aussie blokes. You know what I mean? You know what I mean. I know Furious because you've lived amongst these people, and they were really good blokes. You know what I mean? And if you were lucky enough to be invited to one of their homes, you'd get a big spread dinner or a barbecue or whatever it might be. You know, it was still Australia. It really was. And what I noticed when we were in the Northern Territory then, the Northern Territory, particularly like outside of Darwin, it still had a bit of a frontier feel to it, you know? It did. It still had a little bit of a frontier feel to it. And I think that's what's dying in Australia. And it's the very thing that makes Australia, which is this direct line from the man from Snowy River to people like Crocodile Dundee that would absolutely include the vast majority of the diggers from all the Australian wars, you know. And maybe I'm being a little bit romantic, but I don't think I'm really being too romantic, you know?
Yeah, I agree with you there. But what I'm saying is that a lot of the young people growing up were just attracted to the cities, you know, like attracted away from the. I mean, the actual outback, the amount of population there was fairly small. I mean, the closer farms, you know, like
and always has been, pretty
yeah.
small.
You know, places like Toowoomba and places like that. Obviously, there's a lot more people, but even from those places, there's this draw of the cities. You know, I think that's been one of the things. Now, how farming's been affected by that. I mean, there's been various things. I think. It's very hard to say, I guess. You know, I mean, what's really caused that? Whether it's been the change in farming, you know, like previously people seem to be able to make do on a farming. Farmers were wealthy. There's a lot of farmers were wealthy. They used to send the kids to like top boarding schools and things like that. I'm not quite sure what happened. Maybe this globalization sort of thing, where you're suddenly competing with bananas from the Philippines and, you know, beef from Argentina and things like that. I don't know what it was, but the farms seem to be a lot less wealthy. You know, the whole, so they lost money and they lost people, basically. I think that's been part of it.
Yeah, fair enough. This other night, did I start Entropy? Yes, I did, mate. If you want to ask a super chat question or support the channel, you can do it. And it's pinned at the top of the chat. Before I go on to Eucharist, I'm going to ask Furious about this, because Furious is the most outback of all of us as far as I'm concerned. What do you think is going wrong with the country areas, mate?
I think there's a combination of things. I mean, I could literally go on about it for a long time, but I'll try and keep it concise by saying I think there's three core issues. I'll start with the obvious one by saying and it's hard to sort of quite nut out, a bit of a chicken and egg scenario between economics and social or societal. But on one hand, you know, with there being a depopulation, you have less services, you have less, you know, businesses of sorts, you have even less of that kind of, trying to think of what you'd even call, I mean, the Germans would use a word like Volksgemeinschaft or something, but, you know, like, you know, like say, I'm just trying to think of something that fits. Like, for example, if you think like somewhere in parts of like with the English towns, it might be like, you know, a bridge club, or I mean, we have bowls clubs in Australia, but like, you know, things like that sort of galvanize people and bring them together and gives them like a social outlet where they, you know, have a few beers and they engage in some kind of activity, and then there's a repartee and stuff, right? Yeah, sure.
Furious, can I ask you, like when I did my big outback trip in Australia, and I don't know how outback your family is, but I know you're rural. Like a lot of these little towns used to have like rodeos and stuff like that, you know, which was something people could go to.
There's still that phenomenon is still sort of, to my knowledge, still takes place in, say, like parts of New South Wales and Queensland. Kind of really died out in South Australia and in WA in like the 90s, I think. Well, I mean, it probably still exists in parts, but it's just not near as common as it used to be. One of my dad's mates actually used to ride, bucking bulls and horses and stuff. Like, he actually did it as a matter of course when he was in his 20s and 30s. But I mean, that the days of that actually being commonplace, certainly, outside of Queensland, New South Wales, are fairly long gone now. And
like when I did my trip, Furious, like I met quite a lot of ringers. And for anyone in the chat who doesn't know this, like ringers are the Australian cowboys, basically.
Yeah.
And there were still quite a lot of these guys around when I did my outback trip, 2002-ish. Are those guys still around or what?
Again, you'd have much better luck in, say, rural Queensland or northern New South Wales, but rare to find elsewhere nowadays, because that kind of sort of the Australian equivalent of what you call cowboy culture is very much in that sort of. It started off in that old settler country, and in the old settler country is where it last remains. The problem is in, say, South Australia and West Australia, because they're the two places I'm more familiar with. Via the West. Like I couldn't comment about Tasmania. I know nothing about Tasmania. Is that you just don't have those rural population centres anymore that allow that sustain that. For instance, one of the big things that I don't know if anyone here is into like cars and stuff like that, but Speedway for the longest time was such a popular activity, not just in the country, but I mean a lot of cities used to have Speedway ovals and whatever. And the number of Speedway ovals that are active have, I think, like halved in 30 years. And in the sense that even relatively small towns, I'm talking like towns of say 1,000 people, 2,000 people, used to have a Speedway oval. That's gone. I mean, most places now, for any rural population centres that have 5,000 plus people, insofar they exist, because there's not a whole lot of them anymore, those places barely manage to sustain Speedway anymore. It's just not a thing. And you can put that in the same categories like the whole, buckaroo cowboy, sort of thing, because also we have to consider too that unlike say America that managed to develop that over a long period of time over a vast area amongst a large number of population centers, Australia just always had that problem. And that's what when I was talking about before about the cities on the coast and not much in the interior, that has been in some ways the enemy of the sustaining of agricultural Australia in the long term, is that we just never had these interior states that had their own cities and their own groups of large towns and villages that sort of kept this stuff alive. What we've sort of had is essentially two very large domestic cities, Sydney, Melbourne, right, and three satellite cities, because let's face it, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth are much bigger than Darwin and Hobart, which are the next biggest places, right? And then
Newcastle is about the 5th biggest place in Australia, I think.
Well, true, yeah. Correct. And then you got sort of these larger places like Townsville, Cairns, Newcastle, Wagga Wagga, Broken Hill, Ballarat, Bendigo, etc. Right? And so really much beyond that, you just have these, let's call them what they are, micro towns. The very relatively small country towns, even if they're like 1,000 people or 1,500 people. I mean, it's hard for them to actually say sustaining in the long term. It's not like the USA where you have a place like Little Rock in the middle of Missouri. You don't have like a Memphis in the middle of Tennessee. You don't have like a St. Louis or a Louisville like in the Appalachians. Australia never got to the point of actually having these interior urban settlements, which then like sustained these networks of sort of rural and semi-rural communities. Like everything was fed from the coast, and as a result, as the cities have sort of looked towards more themselves, these rural areas have died as a consequence. Just to canvas back to your question momentarily, Iron Duke. So I mentioned like the chicken egg thing about society and economics, right? So as towns get smaller, economic opportunities contract, right, essentially. And then as the economics contract, less and less people stay, there's more of an exodus, there's less services, and that vicious circle goes on, right? And then that in turn leads to like the third pillar of this discussion, which is the political, right? In the end, more and more House of Rep seats have been, gradually pruned out of rural areas. They call it one vote, one value because that's a nice lefty way of saying it. But basically, it's a case of politically disenfranchising and disrepresenting agricultural people in agricultural areas, despite the fact that if you talk about economics per capita, the rural people carry a lot on their back, and rather than it being sort of Forgese, Ponzi kind of invented spreadsheet economics, right? It's like people who make things and people who produce things. It's miners, it's farmers, it's primary produce in the real sense of the word, who make real commodities and real things.
That's why America, the founding fathers put in the electoral college. They trusted the farmers.
Correct, Chris. You're exactly right. You're exactly right on that. Bang on the money. And why they fixed 2 senators to every state, irrespective of population, right? And the thing is that as a consequence, we are not able, I'm a quasi farmer now, but like farmers as a class and as an interest group now are so disempowered. They have so little bearing on political outcomes. And for example, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but there's been this campaign that's been rumbling for like the last year or so called Keep the Sheep. And the problem is right, if the Liberal Party or an equivalent, right of centre party get in and then re-enable live export, right? The thing is that when another left centre or left government gets in, they'll just ban it again. The thing is, what they don't have is the political awareness to actually say, because what the left do is they establish a new position and entrench themselves politically. It's like, okay, we're going to, like, for example, I'll use an example. I apologize, Andrew, if it's a bit contentious, but okay, we're going to institute, say, civil marriages, or we're going to introduce like marriage equality or something. But then once this is in place, we're not going to allow you to actually revoke it. And moreover, we're going to actually impose these rules by which controls the manner of your lexicon and your dialogue revolve around this subject. If you actually act in an offensive manner, we will prosecute you. So what they do is actually defend their golden goose, as it were, right? The problem is, it's not like anyone will get into power and say, well, we're going to bring live export in, and if you agitate against live export, well, we're going to fine you, or we're going to rescind your position somehow. No, like they'll just flick the switch so that someone else can come in and switch it off again. And the problem is that is so replete, whether it's decommissioning rural railways, right? Whether it's cutting funding to agricultural schools and educational facilities, or whether it's like closing down hospitals, or, whatever example you pick, it happens time and time again. And there's never a stopgap. There's never a hard firewall. Just each time it happens, it's incrementalism in one direction. But us being of the right, we have faced incrementalism our entire lives, and this is what happens. The left have become masters at this sort of Gramscian kind of, incrementalism.
Yeah.
I hope I answered your question, Andrew. I did the best I could.
I don't disagree with Curious.
I wouldn't disagree either. But can I just say, I think possibly, and this is just a theory which just is sort of occurring to me now, but like if you go back 100 years, I don't know, and I'm not a farmer, so I'm just throwing figures out here, but like maybe 20 acres could handle 500 sheep or something like that. And today, 20 acres.
No, it couldn't. No, it couldn't.
Look, I'm just making up a figure.
But yeah, all right.
Yeah, I'm just making up a figure there. But today, that 20 acres would still carry the same amount of sheep. Okay, the land is not that. There's probably been an increase in productivity, but not to a great extent. Whereas the cities have gone from being, basically handling the fruits of the agricultural, so that you had docks there where the sheep's, all the wool would come through, or timber, or the wheat, or whatever, and the city was built. That was the primary industry, was moving this agricultural produce.
Hey, look, Harry, you go around the Melbourne dock area, or the ex-Melbourne dock area, and you'll see enormous, great warehouses that were for Australian wool. But these days, they've all been turned into very expensive flats, basically.
Yeah, but at the same time, what happened after that was you had the Industrial Revolution, where
that was long before that, Harry. But
yeah. But then the Industrial Revolution came along, so the city, the people in the city then became much more productive, actually producing manufactured goods. And then you have the sort of IT revolution, the knowledge economy, where people and the whole thing that you've got offices where they're organizing things, sending things back and forward. So the city became, the people in the city became vastly more productive than they had been.
And now they don't produce anything except LGBTQ and gay pride marches.
The manufacturing has died off a lot, but there's a lot of people who are actually are producing. So I agree with you. There's been a fall off in that, but still, people are still very productive in the city. They're working in places that I don't know, that they're working in IT or working in insurance, whatever.
What are they producing, Harry?
Well, yeah, that's the thing.
Well, a lot of it's services, but services, goods and services. Services are equivalent to goods in many ways. Not always.
In most ways, they're not. To be honest,
Yeah.
with you.
But like from a commercial standpoint, yes.
Oh yeah, from the point of view of people making money from them.
What I'm saying is, comparatively, like go back to the sort of 80s, 90s, and a farmer from Toowoomba will be sending his kids to the top grammar schools in Brisbane, right? And he could compete. He could compete with the people in the city to get those top places. Nowadays, the people in the city are much wealthier, but the farmer is still, relatively speaking, his production hasn't increased at the same rate. So he would no longer be able to compete at all with these people from the city. There's no way he's going to be sending his kids to these top schools anymore. So I think there's to an extent there's been a wealth transfer that the people in the cities have increased.
Do you think that's a good thing?
I'm not saying that's a good thing at all. I'm just saying this is reality. Reality is that technology and such has made people in the city much more.
But we still need to eat, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. But we can still ship. We can ship food in from the Philippines or from South America or from America, wherever.
We can when things are good, but if anything went wrong,
I'm not saying these are good things. I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm just saying that the people in the city are have grown wealthier, comparatively speaking, to the people in the countryside, and so
But that's not a good thing, Harry.
No, I know.
It's not a good thing.
I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying this is the reality.
Australia used to produce beef that went to Japan and went even to Britain. We used to produce mutton that went to Britain. Australia used to produce all this stuff that made the Australian people money.
Work.
It was real stuff that was produced in Australia. And these days, what you have in Australia is half the mineral wealth in Australia, for example, including coal, for example, goes to China. Now, what is the point of Australia having all its coal power stations banned when with just sending that coal to the Chinese who use it in their coal power stations? It makes no damn difference to the climate.
No, but it makes a lot of difference to the Chinese economy.
Yeah, it does. And recently we had the Chinese sailing a squadron of warships all the way around Australia, and the Royal Australian Navy did not have enough warships to even monitor it all the way around.
Yeah. Kind of reminds me of the incidents of Japan during the First World War, when all our ships were sent to Britain to blockade Germany, and we basically had no ships around. And the Australian politicians, they were terrified of all these Japanese ships just sailing around.
No, they were not. I'm sorry, Eucharist. I'm not going to agree with you on this because they were
allies.
true.
But the thing was, there's a book on that.
You're confused, man. Eucharist, you're being confused. No one in Australia was worried about Australian warships. I think I even said to you before we started this stream that in World War I,
Yeah, we're allies, but the
sorry,
thing was, there was
Japanese
like,
warships were escorting Australian and New Zealand troops to the Middle East.
yeah, but
There
the
was
thing
no concerns about that at all. You're just not being correct.
But in the Second World War, that was happening because the Japanese were steaming towards Australia. That was
In
when
the
the Battle
Second
of
World
Coral
War, it
Sea happened.
was. Yes, absolutely, Harry,
I
and
read a
that's
book.
why
I have a book.
that's why good old Labour politicians, we were
John
talking
Curtin.
about earlier, were completely against the Washington Naval Treaty because they said no. If you make Japan an enemy, then Australia becomes vulnerable.
Yeah. I have actually access to a book which claims that there was a fairly large force of Japanese landed on an island just off the Queensland coast, and were getting ready, preparing things for when the Japanese invaded. And then the Battle of the Coral Sea happens, and the book claims that there was a massacre. It's very well documented. All the local newspaper.
No idea, mate. I've got no idea. It could be true.
No.
But
Yeah.
Japan never had enough men to seriously invade Australia in
Sure,
World
yeah.
War II.
But some generals were
But you know, if you look
Right.
at people like Billy
Enough.
Hughes, which Eucharist claims he likes, Billy Hughes was totally against the Washington Naval Treaty because, as he correctly said, it's going to give America parity with Britain with no effort on America's part, and it's going to make Japan our enemy. And Billy Hughes was entirely correct. And I'm furious. You're a history dude like myself, so I'm sure you will know about much of this.
Actually, funnily enough, the Washington Naval Treaty is something I'm not well read on. I have to confess on that. But I do understand the point you're making, and of course, because Japan was a World War I ally of the Western powers, that movement of Japan into the hands of the Axis in World War II did present a massive strategic problem
as was Italy, Furious.
As was Italy.
Yeah, Italy was
Thanks for
also
reminding me.
was another ally of Britain in World War One.
Yeah.
You know?
no useless
exactly.
ally, but
weren't they?
Listen,
bloody
I've
guys.
always Furious. You know, I've always argued that Britain deliberately made Italy an enemy of Britain in the 1930s over Abyssinia, which I've always thought was insane, given that Italy almost certainly ran Abyssinia better than Haile Selassie did. But I mean, that wouldn't have been a very high bar.
No, quite.
They weren't their formidable enemy. At least.
Who were a formidable
the Italians,
enemy?
they weren't a very formidable enemy.
Do you know anything about the Italian Navy in World War II, mate?
Well, weren't they just stuck in like the navy yards because they didn't have enough oil or something like that?
No, you've obviously read only some very minor stuff. The Italian Navy,
I mean that's true to an extent, particularly after 1942. But
it was later on. It was true, but in actual fact, the Italian Navy was vastly more powerful than the German Navy in World War II. Vastly more powerful.
Because Germany has barely any ports in. You know, it's almost landlocked, really, isn't it, Germany?
Yeah, very much so, Harry. Very much so. But you know, the Italian Navy in World War II had loads of battleships, loads of cruisers, loads of destroyers, loads of submarines. It was probably 3 or 3.5 times as big as the German Navy in World War II. And it was a much bigger threat to the Royal Navy than the German Navy was.
Yeah.
The German Navy had a handful of battleships.
Yeah, it's definitely true. It's just that the German Navy wasn't very big during World War II. So I don't know if that's great. I don't know. It's a comparison.
It's worth saying though that obviously with the German Navy being in the state that it was, I mean the Kriegsmarine was born out of the ashes of the Reichsmarine. Because obviously Germany was forced to scuttle and trade off most of its ships from World War One or decommission its fleet therefore, the German Navy on the outbreak of World War II was small, but it was actually very modern. But it's heavy ships, Tirpitz and Bismarck being obvious, but examples. But even like the pocket battleships, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. I mean, what the Germans did have was a modern surface fleet, as the crew on the hood found to their unfortunate.
Well, that was the world's most unlucky shot.
It was a 1 in a million, right? Like it directed on the magazine.
Drachenfell has done a brilliant video on this, which shows what almost certainly happened to HMS Hood and all but 3 of her crew. But if you look at the most modern Italian battleships in World War II, Vittorio Veneto, Furious, I think.
Vittorio Veneto, yeah, and
that was actually a better ship than Bismarck.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that and also Roma.
Yeah,
it
had one extra 15-inch gun. It had one extra 15-inch gun, but it was also a better designed ship than Bismarck.
Oh yeah, for the most part. The only thing the Italian ships were a bit weak on was that because the Italians hadn't quite modernized in terms of, like for example, the Germans obviously tried to build Graf Zeppelin, but never put it. They did commission its hull, but never really put it to sea as such. And obviously the Americans, the Japanese, in a very modern way, and then the British in a slightly more modest way, but still did do this. Embrace naval aviation. See, the Italians didn't really have a naval aviation wing in the same sense. I mean, we never built a carrier.
The Italians were building 2 carriers, I think.
Yeah, they had 2 that were underway. But the point I was going to make was that they were also their ships, even for example, like their heavy and light cruisers, were very modest in the anti-aircraft department. That's why Taranto happened. It's just the Italians didn't really pay much attention to air defense on their ships.
And the British had been planning, to do that since 1918. Like if the First World War had gone into 1919, that would have happened to the German High Seas Fleet. But
probably,
that was the wrong heavy plan. It really was. But
and executed to perfection.
Anyway, we're wandering a lot on topics, I guess.
A long way from ANZAC Day, actually.
Yeah.
Well, we're still on the military.
All right. I will say.
Just as a matter of point, before we change over to ING, allow me to just, because I obviously haven't spoken to Eurekas and Harry before, is that I have the unique honor of actually having had my grandfather actually fight the Anzacs, if I may say so. So I have a very unique perspective because my grandfather, for the longest time, often spoke about his being at Tobruk, and he very, very often spoke glowingly about the Aussies. He thought they were, along with the Kiwis, probably the pick of the Commonwealth troops, and so I sort of always grew up with that admiration for the desert rats and Australian soldiers writ large. That's why I've always loved the movies Charge a Light Horse and Gallipoli. I've always had a fondness for sort of Australian historical movies on that basis, listening to my granddad talk about it. So,
well, if you were going to if you're looking for troops, if you were looking for troops to fight in the desert, you would probably pick an Australian above a Pom. Is what.
There's no better condition for it.
I might slightly resent that, Harry, but all right.
Poor
but, but no. I'm fine. Don't worry. My confidence levels are high. I would just say, look, your grandfather Furious is like someone who fought against them. He's probably one of the best judges of them in some respect. Yeah. And he liked them. And he liked them.
Did.
So,
he did. Yeah. Yeah, because he went over in early 42, just when the Africa Corps first reinforced the Italian divisions that were in disarray after O'Connor's charge across the desert in the first part of the war. And I mean he did sort of speak quite how can I put this, in admiration of the Commonwealth, because I think it can be said that the desert force, as it were, whether it was under Auchinleck or later under Monty, they did for the most part conduct themselves in a fairly adept way. I think for them just confronting Rommel was a bit of a novelty at the time. I mean, Rommel was unconventional even by German standards, the way he sort of fought operationally. But it can be said without any doubt at all that the New Zealand and Australian troops that constituted was it the Eighth Army in Africa, Iron Duke, if
Yeah,
memory
it
serves
was
me
the
correct?
Eighth Army. Yeah,
The Eighth Army,
Army.
fought with, itself fought very, very well, and the Australian and New Zealand contingent of the Eighth Army fought with a great deal of distinction and valor. And I suppose to bring this stream back to an ANZAC theme, I think we can say that, that there's a reason why, no matter in which theatre they fight in. I mean, I when I first came on, I mentioned obviously Palestine and Gallipoli, and we could say the same thing for North Africa, for Greece. I mean, obviously the New Zealand's the New Zealand contingent obviously famously fought its way up the Italian peninsula as well. Like it fought at Catania, it fought at Monte Cassino, and other places. And of course, the Aussies, they fought well, I say fought. They partook in the Singapore campaign. They obviously stopped the Japanese at Port Moresby and through Papua New Guinea, sorry. And no matter where they found themselves, the ANZAC boys always fought with tenacity and with toughness and with courage. And often in very difficult circumstances. You got to think, fighting in the desert around Tobruk or fighting in the jungles of Papua, each in their own way, is not a hospitable place to be when you're not fighting a war, never mind when you are. And to fight against both the Germans and the Imperial Japanese at the height of their military power demonstrates the capability of the Australian soldier of his time.
And they won. And they won, Furious. I mean, one of the things...
To their credit.
Yeah, one of the things, like Australia in those days, I think had about 8 million people, something like that.
A bit less, I think 6, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was 8, but it wasn't more than 8. And the first Allied troops in World War II to beat the Germans on land were the Australians at Tobruk.
No.
Yeah, the Australians at Tobruk. And the first Allied troops to beat the Japanese on land, as Furious pointed out, were the Aussies on the Kokoda Track in New Guinea. So not bad for an allied country with only about 8 million people, The Australian soldiers were damn good, the diggers.
Yeah.
So
I think sorry, Angie, if I can back the point ever so slightly, is that, and this sort of circles back to the themes we've discussed. I mean, you and I have discussed this in several streams we've done together, but I mean, with the two guys here as well, being all of us being proud Australians in our own way, is that what I think certainly the digger of old, and I'm probably including, I'd say even the boys in the Vietnam War, at Long Tan, I'd probably include them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Long Tan. 100-odd Aussies versus thousands of Vietnamese.
Viet Cong, yeah, exactly, and NVA.
Yeah.
And I count the boys in Papua. I count the guys in North Africa. I count the guys in Palestine and Gallipoli. Like the Boer War contingent, the whole lot. Is that they not resembled. They represented, you might say, the best virtues of the Australian man, from the time and place from which he came. So, if you were to say bump into, just a bloke in Wagga Wagga, or a bloke in Ballarat, or a bloke in Newcastle, or Broken Hill, or Kalgoorlie, or wherever, right? Cooper Pedy, Alice Springs, wherever. You pop that bloke into that uniform in one of those theaters, that is this almost the exact same fella. And that bloke he's tough, he's resourceful, he's pretty courageous. He's how can I put this? He's resilient, particularly in tough circumstances, and he knows how to fight. He's got a natural kind of, a bit like, if you read those like a German handbooks from World War II, it's like, we can't even predict what the Americans do because the Americans don't really have an independent doctrine, and Yanks fight wildly. But the same is kind of true of Aussies and New Zealanders.
Used to say that.
Sorry, the Soviets. My bad. Yeah. And but they were like these tough, resourceful, adaptable, pretty stern men. They didn't need flash conditions and lodgings and whatever. And as long as you gave them a rifle and a handful of bullets, they'd hold the line, and they do it without pomp and fuss. Like for all the wonderment of British or the English military tradition, there's that bit of pomposity there from the aristocratic element. The same can be said of Germans. The Germans have like this formality of them from the German, the German general staff and the Prussian officer class, etc.
Yeah.
And the Russians prior to the revolution had like this aristocratic, side to their military as well. But just none of that existed in the Australian mindset, and it demonstrated in their repeated demonstrations of toughness and adaptability. And you sort of hear about like these little trinkets, like for example, those they used to use the cans with the water in them in the trench line at Gallipoli to sort of like mimic gunfire to sort of keep the Turks on edge. Meanwhile, they were having kips in the trenches themselves. Like that's the sort of stuff you'd only imagine Aussie doing, or like a South African, like someone from a tougher environment with ingenuity, and that's the thing I've always found
Someone
really
from a
admirable about the
frontier,
Aussie
yeah.
fighting man. Yeah, the frontierman, exactly.
Yeah, it
Sorry,
is.
go on.
It's a frontier thing. To bring this back to more contemporary things, what do you guys think about the increasing vandalization of not only historical Australian statues like Captain Cook or whoever, but also we're even starting to see it on ANZAC war memorial statues nowadays, which, like, if that had happened 25 years ago, Australians would have been really, really angry about it, because back then the ANZAC was still this perfect Australian bloke, and these days it's like people hardly care.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a omen for coming times that basically there's going to be a much greater attack towards the ANZAC tradition, and I think ANZAC Day will become like Australia Day. There'll be protests against it in I think the next coming decade, basically because of what they fundamentally fought for, which was a white Australia. You can obviously know the quotes like of Billy Hughes, which is like I bid you to fight for white Australia in France, and I've read there's some other quotes. Sorry. List. White Australia is not a policy; it is a religion. That's by like I think Burford Simpson. A lot of quotes like that from more or less the men. And I think fundamentally it's going to become under attack, and it's going to be villainized as like white supremacist or anti discriminatory. And I think that's going to be what's going to occur in the future.
Yeah, all of our legends and heroes and history, everything they're trying to tear down. It's a psychological attack. I believe it's very narcissistic. If you look at the way narcissists work, it's a similar sort of thing that a narcissist will always guilt trip you into everything, that everything you did was wrong, everything everything about you is wrong. You should be apologizing for what you've done. It's disgraceful. This is exactly the tactics that these people use, and they just want to, and so they zero in on things which are great heroic things. The ANZACs, the great sacrifices that they made. It's like, well, they just go in there to try and tear that apart, and so yeah, absolutely. ANZAC and the monuments, all of our heroes, the statues, they're all, and these are, the problem is that these are very widely distributed targets, so they're very difficult to protect. And there's enough people in local councils and the like that when they do it, these people are like, well, the average Aussie probably is up in arms about it, but the people on the councils who bloody got blue hair and a nose ring are like, oh yeah, it doesn't really matter, because they're just part of this, the whole hard left denigration and hatred of everything that's British, white, Australian. The people that built the place, we're the ones that want to tear down. We're the ones they want. They're all, we're the ones that were at the top of the tree, and we're the target. They want what we've got, and they'll stop at nothing to take it off us. And this is what like you were saying before, Duke, that basically the Commonwealth has been stolen from us. Our nation created the Commonwealth to administer and to protect the nation, and that was what it originally did. It was there to protect the nation, which is the people. And then the Commonwealth was infiltrated and taken over by people who basically hate us. They hate our guts, and they want to destroy us. They want to replace us. They want to displace us. And to do that, the trick is that they make us feel guilty for everything, and they try to anything that people
doesn't work with me, mate. You can't make me feel.
It doesn't work with me either. But you take your kids to school, you put your kids in school, and these teachers are plugging in. Every time you go to the assembly, they're telling the kids that, hey, this land doesn't belong to you. It was stolen. It was taken from someone else. It's the traditional owners that own the air and the earth and the sky and the water, and the previous leaders and the present leaders and the future leaders, and it's just every step they're trying to delegitimize and guilt trip people in the exact same way that a narcissist will do to his browbeaten wife or browbeaten husband or
I think they're worse than a narcissist, Harry, to be honest. I think they just hate
they're worse than
European
narcissists.
white
They just possess narcissistic qualities, I think is the point that Harry's making.
Yeah.
But the other thing too is that this is what is the, and I mean, any boffin could put this in a book. Like, this could be a chapter in Spengler for all I care, or Evola. Doesn't matter who the writer is. But this is the quintessential problem of when a nation, a culture, loses control of its institutions and its cultural pillars to those that hate it, whether it's internally or externally. Because in the end, every nation has its traitors within, and every nation or every people has people beyond its borders who also hate them or resent them for any myriad of reasons, be they legitimate or not. Because let's face it, like, what is history if not for the contest between empires and people? But the point is that at least within your own culture, you'd think, or you'd at least presume that ostensibly our society should exist for our benefit, should exist for our future prosperity, exist for our own sense of esteem, and for self-love and self-respect, and being able to perpetuate into the future for generations yet to come. But instead, what actually happens is that our own children are ensconced and marinated in this servile, self-loathing, denigrating, subversive environment, which is orchestrated by these people, by these creatures that you guys have described. And in the end, it's been generations worth. I mean, in the end, how I know I enjoy you come from a different generation, but say, like, I don't know how old these other two blokes are, but if they're a bit older or younger than me, there you go, they're younger than me. Even I was in.
I'm 60. I'm 62.
Oh, there you go. But I was just going to say, like, I was ensconced in that throughout the 90s and 2000s. I mean, I remember it. It just I was impervious. It just didn't affect me. I came from a different mentality, you might say. But I mean, I know countless guys my age who just blink and miss it, just became transformed by the environment they found themselves in. And the thing is, that's how the left win. It's just like, not to get onto a different subject, but for anyone wondering, like, how, for example, whether it was Gillard or Rudd here, or whether it was like Obama and Clinton in America, for the longest time, centre-left Democrat types, social Democrat types were like, oh, no, we want more egalitarianism. We believe that, these people should be shown rights, non-heterosexual people. But, I still believe there's a special place for marriage, we're Christian societies, yada, yada. Like, all the mouthpiece BS comes to the fore, like all the platitudes and stuff. Right? And then the moment enough old people died and enough people that held traditional values died, they all flipped on a dime. All of a sudden, like, this is the most vital issue of our time, is to expand marriage franchise. We have to include these other people. Like, in the end, being heterosexual is too narrow and normative. We have to widen this out. And it's not because their convictions changed, just enough people who disagree with them died. And that is exactly how left-wing progressivism works. And this is exactly why you either need parallelism, where you establish your own institutions, or, insofar it's within anyone's power, take your children out of this mess, because it will only have them go one way, and that is to become a creature of the machine. I hate to say it.
Well, these people are disgusting what they've done, but the problem is that what they've done is they've taken full advantage, because most Australians are actually really decent and fair people. Most white Western people are
Very
decent,
much so, my
fair,
friend. You're correct.
caring. You know, they
Too
want
fair and too
decent
decent
people.
in many
Yeah.
respects.
we want to play win-win. I don't want to screw someone else. I want to do a deal with you so that I'll gain and you'll gain. And we're dealing with people who are win-lose people. They don't want you to win. They want to crush you. They want them to win
At our expense,
at our expense.
specifically.
And when you have people who are
Well,
win-win,
at your
against
grandchildren's
people.
expense, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So you got the people who are playing win-win, which is your traditional Australian, against someone who is on the left who's playing win-lose. You know, these tribal fanatics from
Play for keeps type.
Hardcore, hardcore ideologues, and they're just so the win-lose people will win every time.
Correct. I hope I didn't come across as harsh. I didn't want to sound like I was like dooming or anything. I was merely just diagnosing the problem. I don't want to sound like I was being overbearing, so I apologize.
You're not half as harsh as me, Furious. Let me tell you. But yeah, all right.
Fair enough.
You're not, honestly. I detest these people. They don't want to destroy you. They want to destroy your grandchildren. They do.
Yeah. Well, your grandchildren, your grandparents simultaneously. That's the nub of it, actually. They want to tear down the statues while they'll rob your grandchildren from in front of you. That's the terrible thing.
They want the lot. They want the whole lot. They want you in chains. Yeah.
It's like every time these people who say, you know, the colony will fall, pull down a statue of Captain Cook or Queen Victoria or whoever it might be. And now they're starting to move on to the ANZAC statues. And if you don't make a fuss now, trust me, all your ANZAC statues will disappear. And amazingly enough, there's no police video of people cutting down these statues, even though there are video cameras in those areas. Because
amazing how that works,
though, right? It is, isn't it? Furious.
I think
but hey, if you did a hand signal of a particular kind, they'd find you on the spot. They'll have that video. Don't you worry.
The people that set those cameras up are the same ones that put the camera in Jeffrey Epstein's cell, probably.
Exactly. Same technicians, right?
Same breed.
Yeah, and it went out exactly the moment it needed to go out. Eucharist League, you got anything to say about this?
Well, as a younger guy in the chat, I definitely saw that this anti-white curriculum in display. I went to a lot of I went to a lot of Catholic schools, and they had a particularly strong whole Australians are bad, you know, this is stolen land and stuff like that. Now, I think compared to other guys my age, I was able to break out of that more easily. But I definitely see that a lot of people don't really seem to care that much about Australia. They don't. They're just so reverent, and they're so. I kind of despise my generation, basically. They're so irreverent, and they're not. They don't care about the nation, and They just.
I mean, look, when the first
being a fellow young man, we're from very selfish generations, sadly, Eurekas. But I digress. Sorry, Einjuk.
Oh no! All I was going to say is that, when the first fleet arrived in Australia in the 1780s, there was not a road, or even a track, or any building, or anything on the whole.
There's no airports.
Yeah, it was completely just a wilderness on the whole of the continent. And every single thing in Australia today, which is a modern nation, a modern Anglo-Celtic, Western Christian nation, every single thing was created from the time the first fleet arrived. There was nothing here before that. It really gets on my nerves that you'll get some, usually at most, quarter Aboriginal person saying to me, "Oh yeah, but Melbourne's called Ooga Booga Land because there was a tribe there at the time." but there was nothing that is to today's modern Melbourne, which actually I think might have been a good thing because I don't like Melbourne. But you know, it's just utter nonsense. Like the whole of the modern nation was created by the early Anglo-Celtic settlers. All of it.
It's a European British conception from the very ground up, as all the new well, aside from like this Spanish, Portuguese, and to some degree Dutch colonial adventures, as most of the New World is, certainly that made in the image of the British Commonwealth is exactly that. It is a European, British, English, Celtic conception. And just to touch on the egalitarian thing a little bit, I actually missed the point as well. You're talking also about the nation or the people who conceived of Magna Carta. And I know like boomers tend to sort of go on about Magna Carta, but you think about it as a document from the medieval period whereby it was a control on the crown by the barons and to some degree the well, landed gentry is the wrong word because it's the wrong era, but you know that sort of freedman yeomanry, right? That to use a Sargonism, right? The English yeomanry, right? Whereby, fundamentally speaking, if you were an Englishman, you could not be wrongly imprisoned by the king. Now, I think feudalism gets a bad rap, and I think modernity on purpose misrepresents feudalism in a number of ways, right? But let's not forget that one of the tenets of feudalism was divine right. And as a king, you could act in sort of whatever manner you please. It's just that given the estates of the realm of any given kingdom or duchy or whatever, there were usually checks and balances of the kind. But in England specifically, there was a contractual obligation and a contractual sort of fix on the powers of the king and the nobility that freedmen and the yeomanry could not be violated by the mere whims of his superiors. And that in itself, I think, even though the English are in their own way, I don't mean to provide external judgment of your ilk, Iron Duke, I apologize, but purely from a historical standpoint, as much as the English do have this, and you know, to some degree with even the Scots, but this sense of, you know, pageantry and aristocracy and the class system and nobility and, you know, the land and titles and this sort of thing, that more so than other aristocracy, say compared to various German states, compared to say Austria, you know, the Habsburg, or the French pre the Revolution, and even to some degree even Italy, right? Particularly in like the more northern affluent states of Italy, right? That it was the English, not the others. It was the English who created this great charter of essentially basic rights towards people, and the nation of the United States of America, you know, having come from the 13 colonies, and then by extension Australia and New Zealand, are a sort of a civilizational child of this idea, and we can never forget that because I think it's so formative for us as a country. I mean, I say us. I'm sorry, I'm an imposter as an Italian, but you know, as Australians, I think it's an important part of our psychology and our identity. You get my point.
Your family of no, I don't think so. Your family have been here quite a while.
You're assimilated.
Equality before the law is a great English thing, which in England today or in Britain today we are seeing destroyed. Like Sir Keir Starmer has deliberately made it.
Yeah.
As if you're a white Anglo-Celtic Englishman, you are now second class before the law.
In your own homeland.
In your own nation that you might have lived in for 50 generations.
Yeah, in your own homeland, amongst your own institutions, amongst your own people and culture, yes, you have become the enemy. And the worst thing is that you think of all the worst, like historical examples of tyranny, right? And in the English conception, to some degree, it's Edward I Longshanks. In many respects, it's like King John, you know, the tyrannical King John and the Barons' War.
Did you say
every politician since probably, I would almost say like Gladstone or Disraeli, right? Certainly since certainly post Chamberlain, if I can put it that way, has been worse than King John. That's how we have to think of it in essence. And Blair is just the worst exemplar of that, and Starmer is a worse example than Blair.
We don't hate them enough.
Well, at least as
by the
bad,
way, about Longshanks, did you call Longshanks tyrannical? I thought Longshanks I forgot which Henry. Didn't he abolish usury or something like that?
No, he did, but I'm more. Listen, I don't necessarily agree with the measure, or hang on, I don't agree with the thing. It's just that it was done in a firm way. I'm kind of using a bit of a boomer mentality,
Okay.
mindset of tyrannical. But you get what I mean. Like acting with a
Yeah.
heavy hand is my point.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay. I understand.
Longshanks might have used it to the benefit of the English people, which is the distinction I would make with King John, who just fleeced
Yeah,
his
he's a
people
pretty shitty guy.
and brought in foreign mercenaries to fight the internal war against the barons. But that was a good pick, Eureka's. I'll take you on that. That's a good pickup. I appreciate your interjection because it's true.
Some people like Cromwell, and I would have fought against Cromwell, but only because I'm a traditional Englishman, and therefore I would have supported the king. But Charles III, yeah, don't like him.
Yeah,
Stretching
but
the
in
friendship.
the end, was Charles himself, particularly egregious? I mean, if you really think about it, I mean, you'd have to have AM on because in the end, he's himself actually an Englishman, and he's far better versed in this portion of history than I am. And in fact, if you actually want a really good argument, not to shill a stream, but there's a wonderful stream that was hosted by Morgoth, and we discussed Cromwell. And funnily enough, I take very much a back seat in this, and 3/4 of the stream is between Praise of Folly, who was pro Cromwell, and AM, who's pro Charles, arguing through half the stream. It's actually really funny.
Yeah.
But the amazing thing is that when you actually consider how insufferable the parliamentarians were, I agree with the Iron Duke. I would have fought for King Charles on that basis alone.
Yeah, just
Sorry,
not
go,
because I particularly like.
I personally
King
sympathize
Charles.
with Cromwell a bit, but the thing is, I also know who Cromwell led into the country, and I'm just saying they practice usury a lot, and so that's the main reason why I'd be against Cromwell. But I can kind of sympathize with the guy. But
yeah,
do you have any
But
historical reason
also,
to? Hang on, Eucharist.
Eucharist,
Do
yeah.
you have any historical reason to be against usury and so on?
I think you know the reason. I think there's a certain tribe that loves usury. And
Listen, I'm no great fan of those guys, but I'm just wondering if your anti stuff comes from the other side of that.
Well, I'm anti-usury because fundamentally it creates an imbalanced hierarchy that's kind of just based off like old money. So it's like, well,
Yeah,
you lend out
listen,
money. That's the main reason I'm against usury. So I'm against usury in policy. I'm against it completely in practice, and I'm also
okay.
There's also a type of group that like practicing it.
I get that.
Not every member of that group's bad, but they also cause.
Okay, look,
Eureka's.
I'm no fan. I am no great fan of small hats, mate.
Eureka's. I just want to say,
can we pull this back towards ANZAC because we're getting up towards the 2-hour level. I think we should count 2 hours. Just a last little thing I'd like to throw in from the British Australian community. You were talking before, Duke, about people getting angry about ANZAC statues. For those who don't know, if you go to nameback.info, we've got a whole site up there which we put up for statues being destroyed, and we've done a petition having a whole bunch of people, politicians and the like, signing onto it, saying that this is a really bad thing. So just if you go over to Nameback and have a look there, you can sort of get involved.
Fully support that, Harry. Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, guys. Listen, guys, before we close, I'm going to go round clockwise and ask people to shill their groups. And I'm going to start with Eucharist League. Would you like to show your group before we close?
Okay, so our group, it's Eucharist League. It's at Eucharist League with just like the name on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Telegram. Our primary channel is Telegram, and if you want to contact me to join the organization, just go at Eucharist League Contact. And also I'd like to plug in. I've created a poetry channel called Darwin's Disciple.
Okay,
that's it.
Eucharist League, do me a favor on Twitter, on X. Send me a link that you want me to put in the description, and I'll do that.
Okay.
Harry, would you like to plug the British Australian community before we close?
Nothing I'd like better, thanks, Duke. We're a great organisation. I know I say this and shouldn't, but we've got a fantastic team who are doing great things. So if you want to be part of that and you want to contribute, like even you can just join up, and it's $25 a year, and we're happy to take you $25. If you want to volunteer and do stuff, we're starting to really move forward with getting people in and volunteering. We're starting to do sort of meetups in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, even. And so there's lots going on with the British Australian community. Look for us on Twitter. I think it's Brit_Oz_com. Double M, if I remember rightly, and YouTube, Telegram. We've got all the socials pretty well covered. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, Harry, please email me or on Twitter. Send me the link you'd like under the description, and I'll put it in there. Furious, anything you'd like to plug, sir?
Actually, not much at the moment. I think this is the first stream appearance I've probably done in about 6 months. I apologize. IRL has got extremely hectic at the minute. A lot going on. Certainly like farm wise and other stuff. So I haven't been so active. AM and I are still. We've got a couple of things on the boil. I've got to read some text because I think in the next month we might boot up again, do a bit of a mini series. But yeah, I've actually had not much going on in these circles for a while. So I appreciate the invite, Iron Duke, because I haven't been on for a while. I almost had to brush the dust off my microphone. But just as a brief appeal on this stream, I just want to say, to Eureka's League and to Harry here from British Australia. Sorry, what was your thing called? Is it the British Australian
community?
British Australian community. Yeah. Is that these guys in their own way do excellent work, and I mean, sadly, guys like us are not well furnished with much in the way of resources and certainly any modicum of mainstream support or whatever. And so insofar that you are able to give them a like, give them a follow, and if you can, if they got any like donative services, try and throw a bit their way, because this is what we need. We sort of things are not easy, which not to say that one should give up or that one should be demoralized, but things aren't easy, and the more we can help each other, the better our prospects are. And we should applaud the good work these guys do. I mean, I'm someone just sort of I migrate around from channel to channel and talk, but these guys are actually doing ground roots work where it matters, and I would implore you to support them.
Thanks for that, Furious.
You're welcome, boys, and good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah, totally agreed. I'll just say, Furious, third time I'll ask you, mate. I want to do a stream on Julius Caesar with you, mate. But yeah.
Well, actually, now that I have some free time, it's actually like doable. Like in terms of I have a stream schedule on, so I might have to pull out some books and I'll get reading Iron Duke, because I was going to say maybe if sometime in June, July suits you, we'll pencil in something.
Yeah,
happy with that.
Sure. Mate, I just want to do a stream on Julius Caesar with you because he's always been one of my heroes, and just an extraordinary man and a really great soldier as well. So,
which
definitely.
Can I just on? I know it sort of strays slightly away from the ANZAC thing, but you know what's something I would love to touch on as a bit of a reference point, because this is exactly how I'd like to see the diggers and the ANZACs commemorate in this country, years to come, generations to come, is to think that there's a statue of Julius Caesar in Rome on the outskirts of the old Forum, and you think Caesar was assassinated in 40 BC, right? Hang on. No, he was. I can't remember if it was 60 or 66 when he was assassinated. But anyway, he was sort of assassinated like 40 BC or 36 BC, something like that, right? And just over 2,000 years. It's like 2,060 years since he was assassinated. Romans to this day still lay flowers at his statue all this time later.
And where he was killed, Furious, and where he was killed. I follow an ancient Roman channel that shows you that the spot where Caesar was killed.
Exactly.
He still gets
And that's the thing. It actually isn't because, like, he technically was killed at the Senate, but the Senate House, as they were using it, was under repair. So the Senate were actually convening at the Theatre of Pompey, which is actually where
in
he was killed.
Pompey's Theatre. It was in Pompey's Theatre.
Yeah. Which they only discovered just like either just before COVID or just when COVID started. So it's been a recent discovery.
You can go there and
yeah. And so
and you can go
in
there
my
and
mind,
there's still reefs where he was killed.
Absolutely. And so in my mind, the idea that, you got to think whether it's the Americans with the founding fathers, whether it's, sort of, Washington or or even if you think of like the generals, of the Civil War or whatever, all this statue tearing down nonsense, whether it's Australia with our, I suppose Monash is probably the most famous of the World War I heroes, but, whoever it is that we wish to commemorate in whatever way, and it could even be like, it could be Captain James Cook, it could be Captain, Cook or Captain Sterling or whoever, pick whichever Australian figure who's fundamental, exactly, Captain Arthur Phillip, exactly, Captain Arthur Phillip, whichever statute is commemorating our heroes of our nation's foundation, may they have flowers and wreaths dropped at their feet 2,000 years after their death in the same way that Caesar is, because that's what I would hope would be true for us in this country.
100%, totally 100%. All right, before we finish, I'm going to be back on Saturday with our normal Splendid Isolation current events, news and politics stream with a decided British and old Commonwealth bias. I think we're the only stream that does that anymore. But if you want to see that, 9:30 British time. If you're in Australia, you've got to get up damn early, 6:30 in the morning on Sunday, and then you can watch that. Next week, I've got a history stream coming up on Wednesday, which is going to be the Anglo-German naval race from 1900 to 1914. But it's also going to point out how utterly bad building the German fleet was for Germany in more ways than one. But anyway, I think that will be an interesting stream. Yeah. So, come and check those out, guys, if you would like to. There will be links to Eucharist League and Harry Richardson's British Australian community under the stream after the stream is finished. Although you're going to have to give me an hour or two to get them up because I need to wait for their links, etc. Thank you very much to my guests, Eucharist League, Harry Richardson, and Furious. Very kind of you.
Thank you, lads.
Guys. Yes, thank you.
And I will just.
Thank you, Andy.
I'll just. Yeah, no, you're almost welcome. I will just wish all Australians a happy Anzac Day and go commemorate your forebears. They were brave and good men.
Set the alarm clock early.
Go well, guys, and never let the bastards grind you down. Oh, by the way, I got a super chat. Sorry, before I leave, I got a super chat. Dissident Knight sent us USD $25 and just put a salute on there. And thank you very much, Dissident Knight.
Thank you, Sir Knight,
for supporting the channel. That was very kind of you to support the channel. Go well, guys. And happy Anzac Day to everybody. See you.
Happy Anzac Day, all.
Happy Anzac Day.
Happy Anzac Day.